Welcome everyone to round two. So we're really on the first panel, but we're in the second stage, the discussion stage. And if I'm not mistaken, we have an hour and a half for discussion, which gives me plenty of time for my to give my comment. Now, I'm going to actually give kind of a separate paper in order to address the two questions which are in the panel theme, and the two panel questions are: how did the term genocide come about, and what was the intention? And the first two papers in particular gesture to that. The second question in the program is: how did the concept evolve in the post-World War II environment? And to the extent that the drafting process is that early part of that, Anton's paper is key. But of course, Carolyn's presentation told us about the French case, about which we hear far too little. Most people talk about the British and American reception. So that was a terrific contribution. I am going to try to address these two questions in very much an historian's way. So the publicity of the UN's deliberations about a Genocide Convention between 46 and 48, which Anton spoke about, immediately launched genocide as an ideological weapon to level accusations in the age of decolonization and the Cold War. And yet, despite the egregious violence in which millions have died and civilians have died since 1948, no international prosecutions of genocide took place, as we know, until the ad hoc criminal tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So it was about a 50-year break. Now, even now, establishing genocide is extremely controversial, whether in Darfur or in Myanmar. Now, in view of these difficulties, there are good reasons to ask whether the House of International Criminal Law is built on shaky conceptual foundations. Concepts like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace do not possess ontological status, no matter what black-letter lawyers think, and apologies to any black-letter lawyers who are in the room. These concepts are neither naturally given, nor do they enjoy timeless validity. They're products of history, of particular conjunctures of ideas and interests, and I think the negotiating dramas which we heard about today from Anton really expose how contingent these are. Now, how then did these legal concepts of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression evolve during the Second World War as competing notions of Nazi criminality? Now, most non-historical scholarship and commentary on the genocide concept understands genocide and these other crimes as a natural category, by which I mean it reflects a reality that occurs in events in history, along with these other crimes I've mentioned, which are all in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court from 1998. And I'll repeat them: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression, which of course were first codified by the International Military Tribunal in 1945, the Nuremberg trials. Taken together now, the United Nations constitutes these bundle of crimes as atrocity crimes. I think we heard that from Andrea in the introduction. Now, I'm sure, because there are many historians in the room, that we question this presumed naturalness and also the coherence of this atrocity regime, that they all are somehow fit together logically and in an integrated way. Now, although all these crimes have roots before the 1940s, they actually crystallized in code-like formulations in this decade, in the 1940s, in the lead up to the Nuremberg indictments. Now, far from developing in an integrated manner, I think, they're actually rival concepts, which account, of course, for the problems in international law and politics today. Above all, the view that genocide is the crime of crimes, which has the Holocaust as its archetype. There are, I think, then, two contingencies from the 1940s: how and why the genocide term gained instant attention when rough equivalents like terrorism, destruction, let alone crimes against humanity, were widely used at the time by other emigre scholars and leaders. And the second question is, how and why genocide appealed to leaders of so-called small nations, the Czechs, the Poles, the Ukraines, if you like, who were occupied by Germany, and as well to Jewish and Christian groups in the US in particular, who were dissatisfied with the outcome of the Nuremberg trials. Were it not, one could hypothesize, for these unpredictable coalitions between small nation leaders and Jewish and Christian groups in the US in 1945, 46, 47, 48, Lampkin's notion may have been stillborn. There are other concepts floating around. Genocide may not have broken through. We shouldn't take for granted that it was a foregone conclusion, that it would become institutionalized in law and be monumentalized as the crime of crimes. Now, in the main, the history of these concepts, these legal concepts, is told in the literature as an upward, if uneven, march towards perfection. You get that particularly in the international law literature. After the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, this story casts the failed post-War I trials of Turkish and German personnel as a way station to the full realization of liberal internationalism after the Second World War, with the first human rights revolution, the Nuremberg trials, the Genocide Convention, the Human Rights Declaration, the Geneva Convention. And then, 50 years later, with the Rome Statute. Now, to answer the question from the first panel, subtitle, how did the term genocide come about and what was the intention? I think we have to engage in a detailed analysis of the transnational discussion in the 40s, in the early 40s and mid-40s, between London, where exiled representatives of occupied states, particularly of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Belgium, rubbed shoulders with British diplomats and lawyers, in New York and Washington, where the World Jewish Congress was developing its notion of war crimes in the teeth of State Department resistance, and in Moscow, where Soviet scholars, especially Trenin, were conceptualizing the notion of aggressive warfare. At the same time, 1941, 42, 43, comparatively isolated in North Carolina, and this is where Doug's work comes in, Lampkin was fashioning his notion of genocide, but very isolated. Now, naming and prosecuting Nazi criminality was the question for everyone, because in the early 40s, everyone was thinking about post-war trials of Germans. The Hague Conventions only partially captured German occupation policies, these lawyers, diplomats, and scholars in London, New York, and Moscow suggested, which led to an intense interest in the meaning of the so-called Martin's Clause of the 1899 Hague Convention, which placed occupied populations, quote, under the protection and empire of the principles of international law as a result from the usages established between civilized nations from the laws of humanity and the requirements of public conscience, until states agreed on a more complete code. So whether and how to codify the Martin's Clause were the bones of contention in the early 1940s. Now, because each concept, crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, war crimes, and genocide, developed in a competitive relationship in these 3 or 4 years, we need to understand the field of terms used to name Nazi criminality, and not just focus on genocide and narrate it unrelated to the competitive field. This is how historians do intellectual history well, I think. Now, many have speculated, as you know from Samantha Power's book, I think it's the title of her second chapter, that Lampkin was inspired by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's speech soon after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 41. When the British intercepted German cables detailing mass executions of civilians, especially of Jews, Churchill made a BBC broadcast in August. And he said, since the Mongol invasions of Europe, there has never been a methodical, merciless butchery on the scale or approaching such a scale. We are in the presence of a crime without a name. And that's the title of Samantha Power's chapter 2, I think, of her book. This famous rhetorical flourish has often been taken to refer to the Holocaust, with Lampkin naming genocide as that crime. But if you actually read the sources, Churchill mentioned Soviet patriots meaning the civilian population as a whole, rather than Jews in particular. There's a whole cottage industry of literature, Brightman's work, other people's work, who've gone into, looked at the documents and seen that Churchill actually circled the word Jew in the transcripts, but he didn't then incorporate it into his speech. And the question is why. There's a long story about that. It's got to do with tipping the Germans off that they knew they'd intercepted the cables, etc. Or is it anti-Semitism? We'll leave that aside. The fact is that these crimes did have a name at the time. Churchill was lying or being economical with the truth or being, making rhetorical flourishes. There were even several names. Terrorism was in fact the common term used at the time to refer to excesses against civilians. It had featured in the 1919 Commission of Responsibility report about Central Powers crimes in the First World War, which listed, and I quote, murders and massacres, systematic terrorism was the first count. Not for nothing did contemporaries in the 40s refer to Nazis as terrorists who committed atrocities and war crimes. The Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov's diplomatic note from January 42 referred to the German army's bloody terrorism. Already in October 41, Roosevelt condemned German reprisal killings of hostages as terrorism. The common assumption at the time was such atrocities occurred when terrorists took over a state and made it the instrument of their purpose, and that's with the Nazis. Of course, 20 years earlier, the view in the West was terrorists had taken over the Russian state. They were known as Bolshevists, and the Bolshevists were terrorists. So this was the common language at the time. Interesting then, from an historical, non-teleological perspective, well, why did Lampkin feel the need to invent a new word when there was a word already that did that work to a large extent? Now, the representatives of the occupied or invaded states who convened at the Inter-Allied Conference in the St. James Palace in London in January 1942 also used this very broad vocabulary. So this is a year before genocide is invented in Axis rule and published then 2 years later in 1944. So their declaration lent on the 1919 Commission on Responsibility report and the Molotov note in decrying the German policy of aggression and regime of terror, which consisted, and I quote, of imprisonments, mass expulsions, execution of hostages and massacres, which violated the Hague Conventions on land warfare, they said. They're thinking legally about and possibility of trials. Hague law, that is war crimes, was the legal category to understand and prosecute Nazi criminality, they said. These leaders often complained that the failure to convict German war criminals after the First World War emboldened the Nazis to launch the current war. And they would not allow repetition of this failure, and for this reason their declaration was actually called Punishment of War Crimes. But the Hague Convention only partially captured German occupation policies, they continued, leading to an intense interest in the meaning of the so-called Martens Clause of the Hague Convention, which I quoted. Now let's remind ourselves of the terms people were using in the early 1940s. If you read the literature about by emigre scholars in the press, by state leaders, what words did they use before genocide existed? Even before crimes against humanity appeared in the Nuremberg indictment. They used words like aggression, crippling, enslavement, destruction and extermination, as well as terrorism and war crimes, to cover German policies. So the historian asks, who's not working teleologically from behind, if you like, so how and why could genocide assert itself against this quite broad array of terms, and then really break through with a UN resolution in 1946 and a convention 2 years later? Well, you're going to have to wait for my book. That's what comes out in a year, where I go into some detail. But what I'm suggesting to us now is that we need to move beyond Lampkin to understand how it broke through. We need to understand the field of possibilities in which genocide then inserted itself in 1944. Now, the second panel question is, how did the concept evolve in the post-World War II environment? Now, there are a number of issues here, and I'm only going to address several of them. Now, one of the key issues, indeed problems, as Christian Gerlach and Antonio Ferrara have written, is the ethnicization of violence that genocide entails, because genocide is a crime against national or racial groups. Now, certainly this outcome was not implicit in Lampkin's conceptual starting point. He began his justification of genocide in promising terms when he declared that the distinction between civilians and combatants was elemental. Genocide was, he said, the antithesis of the Rousseau Portalis doctrine, which may be regarded as implicit in the Hague regulations. These are his words. This doctrine holds that war is directed against sovereigns and armies, not against subjects and civilians. In its modern application in civilized society, the doctrine means that war is conducted against states and armed forces and not against populations. So that's where Lampkin starts. And I think he's on the right track there. Here he declared the underlying criminal principle was warfare engaged against populations rather than armies. Today, customary international humanitarian law refers to the principle of discrimination or the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. But then Lampkin and the United Nations specified genocide as a national, ethnic, racial, and religious crime, excluding other categories of civilians. The convention thus defines genocide as the intent to destroy in whole or in part national, racial, ethnic, religious groups. You've heard this a million times. By a variety of means affecting their physical and biological existence. And Doug's book is very good on Lampkin's thinking in cultural and in national terms. Now, the UN omitted contentious provisions from two draft conventions, as we know from Anton's presentation. The Western powers ensured the exclusion of attacks on language and culture because they're colonial empires and their own domestic racism, particularly in the US. The Soviet Union and some Latin American states insisted on excluding political groups from the list of protected entities and political motivations from the intent requirement so they could persecute anti-communists or communists, respectively, depending on which case we're looking at. And population expulsion, what today is called ethnic cleansing, was never considered, even in the Secretariat's draft, because the Allies had consented to the expulsion of millions of Germans from Central and Eastern Europe. And I've looked in the British and the American documents as well, and it's very clear that they're nervous about that. I think in the American documents they say, on the grounds of expediency, our consent to Potsdam and Yalta. Although UN delegates did not use the term Holocaust, they were acutely conscious of the Nazis' extermination policies against Jews and defined genocide to capture their extremity and, above all, the racial focus and ideological motivation. So the Holocaust, although the term's not used, does become the archetype for genocide really from the beginning, I think. Consequently, genocide was depoliticized as a murderous attack on a people solely on the basis of their hated group membership, merely for who they are. And this definition essentially ensured, I think, that a state could avoid committing genocide by claiming to act for political or strategic reasons. As a consequence, we think more about the victims of genocide during World War II than the overall civilian casualties, which were a staggering 65 million. So when undergraduates, when we teach our genocide and Holocaust classes, undergraduates are fixated on 6 million Jews. Occasionally there's the Simon Wiesenthal, 11 million victims of the Holocaust, 6 million Jews, 5 million other, gypsies, Roma, etc. But people forget that 65 million civilians died. This is, of course, a reasoning in the denial of the Holodomor and the Armenian genocide, that they were murdered for strategic political purposes and not for racial hatred purposes. I'll elaborate on these points in my roundtable tomorrow afternoon. Now, a second and related problem is the conception of genocide as a hate crime indexed to the Holocaust, as I've suggested. The ethnic definition of genocide is compounded by its conceptualization as an irrational hate crime. Innocent, blameless victims are attacked for racial rather than for political reasons, for who they are and not for what they or members of their group have done. And this is what distinguishes, according to this theory, genocide from crimes against humanity. Primordial antipathy or ideologically driven racism rather than rational political considerations, are supposed to motivate the perpetrator. I'm very up against all this. I'm just telling you this is how it's been conceptualized. In law and in popular culture alike, genocide is thus a crime against identity. And this understanding of genocide is indexed, as I've suggested now, to the Holocaust. If the Holocaust is unique, as often asserted, it's because European Jews were not engaged in an uprising against Nazi rule. Their agency consisted variously of escaping, resisting, surviving, retaining dignity in the attempt to exterminate them. But they were politically innocent, which is what Caroline Fournet's paper about the French courts draws our attention to as well. You know, Jews who were in the French resistance were innocent, were not politically innocent because they were politically active. They had political agency and could thus be legitimately executed in reprisals or as bandits, under Hague law, incidentally, as well. But if they were not politically active, then they were innocent. But I want to question these very categories. I think they're extremely troubling. This image of innocent civilians who are killed purely on the grounds of their identity rather than for having participated in a political rebellion and so forth has proven irresistible for those groups, including, I'm afraid, Armenians and Ukrainians, who are seeking recognition as innocent and blameless victims of persecutions and do deserve recognition and compensation. Victims of various conflicts therefore routinely construct themselves as Jews, killed for their identity rather than for their deeds, likewise virtuous martyrs. And the symbolic stakes are so high that the analogical quest continues until the present day, just as the memorial authority in Jerusalem is called Yad Vashem, the Holocaust martyrs, and Heroes Remembrance Authority, so the Armenian Genocide Museum and Institute in Yerevan refers to its victims as holy martyrs, even retrospectively beatifying them in April 2015, converting all 1.5 million into saints. The criterion of the ideal or exemplary victim, which is, of course, a socially constructed status by which sympathy and legitimacy are conferred on certain objects of violence, but not on others, is clear. As martyrs, the dead were sacrificed as members of their group, targeted because of their despised identity, and bereft of political agency. So in trying to then gain recognition, even good historians play down the political agency of the martyrs in order to construct them as innocent Jews. And it distorts the historical record. The last problem is the view of genocide as the crime of crimes, which is evident in the French law as well, mentioned by Caroline Fournet. Is one reason that the French judges never seem to want to use it. International law and popular culture regard genocide and its archetype, the Holocaust, as the ultimate violation. The result is not only to trivialize war crimes and crimes against humanity, but also to exclude the aerial bombing of civilians, which likewise violates the principle of distinction and is often deadlier. The Holocaust exercised a profound effect in establishing this hierarchy. Genocide has come to enjoy the status of the crime of crimes, of course, a subtitle of William Shabitz's famous book on genocide and international law. The Economist magazine calls it the ultimate crime, echoing a UN report from 1985, which pronounced genocide the gravest violation of human rights it's possible to commit. But they never ask, well, why is it graver than the other crimes we've mentioned? This conventional wisdom is repeated by lawyers, diplomats, and politicians. I'll spare you the quotations. But let's not forget that the Rome Statute of the ICC imposes heavier sentences on those convicted on genocide and also disqualifies the defense of superior orders, which are available for those accused of war crimes. In doing so, the Rome Statute reflects the hierarchy of crimes understood by UN officials. This outcome would have pleased Lampkin, who in his tussle with the rival notions of crimes against humanity and human rights in the late 40s, insisted that genocide is the most heinous of crimes, it's the crime of crimes. Now, 70 years later, this notion is the conventional wisdom and the central pillar of contemporary legal memory and politics. Almost without fail, those claiming to speak for an ethnic or national group invoke genocide to draw attention to apparent persecution, expulsion, and destruction. I think Andrea was getting at some of these problems in Challenges in his introduction. And it's not surprising people do this, because genocide does capture public attention in a way that war crimes, crimes against humanity do not. When the UN report on Darfur came out, and I think in '97, there was an audible sigh of relief in Khartoum when they were only accused of crimes against humanity and not genocide. I mean, this is grotesque. As a consequence of genocide's depoliticization by ethnicization and hierarchicalization, it's convenient for actors to demarcate genocide from civil war. This is, I think, work that Scott is interested in as well, and insurgency, as well as from warfare proper. However problematic this distinction, I think, Article 2 of the UN Charter forbids intervention in non-international armed conflicts unless they threaten peace. That's Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, meaning that international interdiction of the mass killing of foreign civilians is illegal in most circumstances. As before the so-called human rights revolution of the 1940s, therefore, states can violently repress their own civilians during proclaimed national emergencies. They can also legally kill the civilians of other states under the cover of military necessity, proportionality, and collateral damage. Saudi missiles have killed more than 9,000 Yemenis in just 2 years, more than the 5,000 Iraqi civilians killed in Russian and coalition airstrikes, while over 2,000 Gazan civilians perished at the hands of Israeli ordnance in 3 operations in 2008. Civilians. To ensure their technological advantage in the early Cold War years, the Americans and the British governments conspired to exclude nuclear weapons from regulation by the Fourth Geneva Convention. Fatally then, Lampkin in the, this is where I'm finishing, fatally then, Lampkin in the UN monumentalized only depoliticized racial destruction, thereby attenuating the principle of distinction that he himself invoked when defining the crime of crimes. The UN Convention thereby entrenched the virtually untrammeled sovereignty of states in their internal affairs and a relatively free hand in waging aerial warfare abroad. Think about the American bombing of Cambodia and northern Vietnam in the Vietnam War. I think the casualties are several million, but never spoken about in a genocide studies course. It was inconceivable for the community of nations to protect civilians in general when they met to effect a human rights revolution in the second half of the 40s, because that would entail proscribing their own conduct during the Second World War and tie their hands in defending their empires or waging the predicted war at the beginning of the Cold War. The Genocide Convention's partiality is reinforced by the ubiquitous lessons of the Holocaust to promote ethnic and religious toleration, rather than to question proclaimed security emergencies and declarations of security threats. So as a result, politically motivated violence does not shock the conscience of mankind, to use the language in the preamble to the Genocide Convention. So these are the problems I see, among others, in the genocide and the way it's developed in the Second World War. And I think the papers we heard today, in their punctual way, highlight these problems and give us a lot to think about in the next hour we have for discussion. Okay, so now we should let the discussion begin. And those who want to say something, raise their hands. Okay. Shall we just take 3 at a time? Yes. And get things going? Yes.
Yes, on the issue of martyrs, as far as the Ukrainian Holodomor is concerned, the first uses that I find are in 1954 with the building of the Memorial Church in Bound Brook, which became and is used by the church. I don't think this is has something to do with the Jewish Holocaust. I think it has to do with the destruction of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church in 1930, and the tendency of churchmen to see this as one act, that is the attack on the Ukrainian religious institutions, and then of course the Holodomor of 33. And the church uses this quite consistently, where secular society and the emigration still calls them victims. The church continues to use them as martyrs. It has to be researched more, but I don't really see the connection on that.
Robert Kreb. Oh, we're waiting for the mic. Is this being podcast or projected?
Thanks very much. It's really a comment on the paper of Caroline Fournier and the distinction that she made between political victims who are, in a sense, willing participants in a conflict and therefore perhaps deserve what they get, and ethnic victims who are targeted purely for ethnicity. In the cases of Indonesia, China and Cambodia, the perpetrators and the victims were largely of the same ethnicity, and yet the victims were not just targeted, the political victims were not just targeted as political activists, the targeting extended across whole families. So in a sense, political identity was ethnicized. So it blurs the distinction between political and ethnic persecution.
Yes.
I'm Numberous from Presidency University, Kolkata, and my question is for Dr. Irwin Rickson. Thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned that supporters of Lampkin also included Zafarullah Khan from Pakistan and Vijay Lakshmi Pandit from India. Generally, India and Pakistan are seen as opposing each other at almost every international forum. So this certainly appears to be one of the few exceptions. This leaves me wondering as to where they were coming from. Were they seeking means to accuse each other of perpetration of genocide? Could you please tell us a little about that? Thank you.
Why don't we come back to the panel? Yeah, who wants to go first?
Okay. Well, maybe the question of India and Pakistan is wonderfully rich. So Lampkin, I can't understate enough my sense that we don't have a genocide convention if you don't have former colonies and small states demanding it. This is crucial, and the other aspect of this is in the UN debate, the Genocide Convention was going to go through the General Assembly. Every country had one vote. The intellectual participation of jurists who were not from the West was just as significant as jurists who were from the West. So what emerges within the story that we have the received scholarship is a story of the Genocide Convention that tends to minimize the contributions of non-Western states. There's no reason to. So for Pakistan and India they both grabbed hold of different aspects of this concept of genocide. The colonial part of it was key for them. That was crucial. For India, the notion of the national pattern and the cultural and that preservation of a way of life was crucial. So you can contrast, Gandhi's very famous letter to UNESCO, right, where he said something like, "I learned more from my illiterate grandmother about human rights than all of your universities put together," right? And then you have the Indian delegation announcing officially that the Genocide Convention represents the philosophy of Gandhi, right there on the floor of the UN, right? At the same time, what's in the back of that is this notion of the anti-colonial aspect of Lampkin's thought, which gets erased. It's gone by the second draft. It's done. Pakistan had the same anti-colonial aspect of it that they grabbed hold of, but they worked with Lampkin to prosecute what Lampkin called the world genocide of Muslims. And Lampkin continued this all the way through the 50s. This part is Lampkin will tell any audience what they want to hear, right? And you meet a group and he says, genocide, where he's telling New Zealand that genocide was a quintessentially labor position. And the labor government of New Zealand had to pay attention to genocide because of its importance for workers, right? I mean, this is Lampkin being Lampkin. But the delegations also saw this as a way of keeping the British from coming back, but then also accuse each other of genocide. So what emerges is this delightful interplay where they're both accusing each other of genocide, but both working together to make sure that the Genocide Convention passes. It's a wonderful wonderful little play.
I want to supplement on India, Pakistan. It wasn't quite that they wanted to accuse each other because there was a slight difference. In India, it said, well, actually what happening was interethnic violence. I mean, it didn't go as far as genocide, while Pakistan said with regard to India that was genocide. And of course, Lampkin comes in, and I mean, it's quite bizarre sort of correspondence. Like, for example, on the top of my head, I think December, let's say 48, he approaching Indian authorities about the interethnic violence in Punjab and kind of says, well, what do you think this kind of thing, does it fit this article of future Genocide Convention talking to Indians and seeking their support on that? So there was a lot of such kind of bizarre things, which is also in my book. Documents. A few other things, I mean, that Derek spoke about. First of all, it's very interesting connection between the crime of terrorism and genocide, something that Doug wrote as well. That was question for me, for example, why Lampkin came up with this concept of barbarism and vandalism exactly in 1933. Well, of course, this process of codification of international law ongoing, but actually, and that's coming from Mark Lewis, I think we indebted to him really, actually it was our idea to come up with international offense of terrorism. So it is coming with the concept of terrorism. That's why the Soviets so much against it, because they didn't want to be, you know, as our offending party as a terrorism. And of course, terrorism and what terror, I mean, they have the same root, right? Also very interesting nowadays, there is kind of more and more interest and fascination with the East European lawyers, particularly contribution against something that Doug spoke. And of course, it comes largely from Philip Sand's book, right? Lauterbach, Pelle, and others. I know at least, for example, at least 3 people who are working right now on Trainin. It's really fascinating character and very important Soviet criminal lawyer indeed. And I mean, there was indeed a cross-pollination between all of these scholars. Also with the issue of a cultural group that came out. I mean, actually, pretty much everyone was against cultural groups, I mean, including Canada or UK, Scandinavia, Latin America. Again, if someone looking for a sort of subject for a good article, or maybe even master thesis, for example, role of Canada in negotiation of Genocide Convention, Bill Shabbos did an excellent job. There is an excellent article about Canada and the negotiation of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and he have just a few footnotes in his book about Canada and Genocide Convention. And Canada said explicitly, there is no way we're going to sign if a cultural genocide is in. Sweden said explicitly, well, we have a problem with the Sami minority in the north. I mean, Norway said also, I mean, well, culture genocide, they didn't explain, but they said, well, it will cause us difficulties. The only one who pushed it were the Soviets. And of course, for them, as there's my
Pakistan.
Yeah, Pakistan. Yeah. And I mean, of course, it's also quite ironic, you know, when you look at mass deportation of the whole population groups, you know, Chechen, Ingush, the others. I mean, how many provisions did they do so they can exercise their culture in exile? None, of course. So it's kind of we deal with this self-righteousness, as I call it, with regard to the Soviets. But the Holocaust, yeah, obviously it's kind of archetypal case. But on the other hand, if you read Lampkin, his chapter in genocide in his book Axis Rule, I mean, he's talking about other different groups. He emphasizes not just the Jews, right? He spoke about the Roma, for example, and linguistic minorities, and some of the minorities we don't recognize as a case of genocide nowadays. But he really have this kind of very expansive notion of genocide. Also, the idea of a genocide as a non-political crime, that, for example, was a very big issue for the British, much more than colonial issue, I would say, is a non-political crime for the matter of extradition. And for the British, we're very concerned that we're not extraditing sort of basically on political grounds. Then also, I would love to ask a question to Caroline, who is not here. But for example, from her paper, now I'm kind of an empirical historian. I always get upset when someone said, oh, we don't know about this particular episode to that because we don't have sources. Sources are available. We just need to go and look for them. And we had this discussion before with regard to Israel, for example, other countries. With regard to France, how significant was colonial issue, for example? I'm pretty sure these documents are all in archives. In the British case, for example, in the UK, already in December 1949, they sent the draft Genocide Convention to all colonial governments. I mean, for example, 26 of them asked, would this convention, if we sign, cause problems for you? Most of them said no. But some, again, top of my head, maybe 4 or 5 said yes, if it can be construed as a cultural genocide, then it's a problem. But in the end, they decided actually a colonial question by 1949-50, for the British, it was not as significant. Was it for the French? Well, it's all in archives, I'm pretty sure. Another country, Belgium, and the Netherlands. So that's, here you go, the subject for the dissertation, particularly if you look at it comparatively.
Round two. Gentleman at the back.
My question primarily to Douglas and Anton. It appears to me that the fundamental difference, or at least significant difference, between the text of the convention, as it was, as we know, the compromise between the Lampkin original concept and those great powers, and the Lampkin sort of initial or original concept, is threefold. And I wonder if you can help me maybe add more or subtract those three, from those three. One is the issue of genocide as a colonial crime. So it was explicitly struck from the text of the convention, for obvious reasons that we just discussed. The second was the issue of, the groups themselves. For Lampkin, as far as I understand, that didn't really, he wasn't really limiting himself to any particular groups. It just came out as a practical necessity to introduce some groups into the text. To him, it didn't really matter which group, whether it's self-described or described by the perpetrators. That's all that matters. That group, the members of this group were killed just as such, right? The members of the group. And the third is the introduction of this notion of intent, which for Lampkin, it didn't really matter. So you didn't have to prove the intent because the outcome of policies is really all you have to look at. Okay, and that introduction of the intent made it extremely difficult to prosecute perpetrators because it's such a high bar for that. So do you agree? Anything to add to that? Thank you.
Because that was sort of three questions, why don't we go straight to the panel?
So I can talk about the necessity of limiting groups. Absolutely, this is, Lampkin's notions of group belonging and group membership are very much not defined, right, in his early works. It's just simply groups that consciously see themselves as groups, and for a nation, for him, it's as big as the Jews and as small as gamblers, right? Like what he's really, really concerned with is this application of, it doesn't always have to be states, sometimes it can be non-state actors, but the application of force to actually break apart these forms of group belonging, right? This is in his analysis of the Soviet penal codes, it's embedded in his work on barbarism and vandalism. And that's what brings us into this discussion of state violence against civilians, right? And that's what links Lampkin's work with this work of, what are states doing against civilians? Historically, the notion of which groups are privileged and which groups aren't, Lampkin can be caught on record in public saying that he proposes to get rid of political groups because they don't have a strong culture. But that's because he knows that if he doesn't do that, his Genocide Convention is sunk. So the history of the Genocide Convention is Lampkin changing his definition constantly in order to change his ideas so that the thing passes. So I would agree with you completely that the limiting of groups is a practical necessity. My opinion, it makes the concept not very workable, right? It really, but.
I think the core issue in talking about Lampkin, we should always distinguish, and I think Doug agree with me, there is Lampkin, the author of the Axis Rule in Occupied Europe and the concept of vandalism and barbarism, and the co-author of the Secretariat draft on 47. And then the Lampkin, who is trying to be as a lobbyist or a politician starting from spring, summer, fall of 1948. And there are two Lampkins here. So when you read his statements, it really can be the kind of the opposite meaning. Say, for example, genocide is a colonial crime. And I mean, for every case, I always have an anecdote to tell. I don't remember, probably from 1950, Lampkin trying to convince the Italians to sign Genocide Convention, and he referring to Yugoslavia, whom he just tried to convince to sign the convention so they can take them on the issue of Trieste, for example, under the heading of a Genocide Convention. And he talks about crimes committed against Italians in 1935 in Abyssinia by sort of a local population. He putting it on his head, basically, because now we presume that actually it's Italians who are, invaded Abyssinia and committed crime, not the other way around. But again, it fits together with the Lampkin's idea of barbarism and vandalism. Political groups, as Doug just Lampkin mentioned, it was really, it's a Lampkin struggle. He was a huge efforts in 1948 to scrap the political groups among those protected by Genocide Convention. He's really going particularly hard against the British and accusing them of flip-flopping on this issue. In terms of intent, as we now know in courts, I mean, basically, they use this kind of circumstantial intent to use it that the body of knowledge or kind of the end result. So I think that in the long term has been sort of to an extent resolved, I think.
Or
It's difficult to say yes or no, but I mean, if you read Lampkin from different years, you can get whatever answer you're looking for.
Now we have, I think we should move, not just have men, so it's terrific. So I can't, my glasses need a new prescription. It's Annie, right? Deborah, sorry. Deborah and then Carolyn and then Andrea. Sorry, no, I'm sorry, not Andrea, the gentleman behind you. He had his hand up, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Deborah.
Thank you, and thanks to the presenters today for fascinating papers. I've really enjoyed them. One of the things that we've talked about a lot this morning is just how much that definition of genocide in the proposed convention changes from that first Secretariat draft through to the final convention, but that is quite a typical process at the United Nations with, if we can think of more contemporary norms like the responsibility to protect and how much it changed before it was endorsed, or even just any sort of UN Security Council resolution and how much they evolve before they're finally passed. So I guess my question is, do you think there's anything sort of atypical in the amount of evolution or change compared to other resolutions at that time? Do you think, the negotiations and the changes really stand out in a particular way, or is this just part of the normal UN negotiation process? Thank you.
Carolyn.
Thank you very much. The papers were excellent, and Professor Moses, you blew my mind with some of the questions that you have about how to define genocide. It's so interesting, and whether we should include war crimes. But I'm a German historian, and I wanted to ask the panelists what West Germany's response to the conception of genocide was, the Lampkin conception.
Thank you. My name is Piotr Wrubel, and I would like to ask historical questions since history is in the title of our conference. For over 10 years, Lampkin worked as a state prosecutor for the Polish government, both in Warsaw and in Eastern Galicia. How far did this professional engagement influence his thinking? And to extend this question, he was born in a shtetl in Belarus and was raised initially in a poor Jewish shtetl in Belarus. Did this experience also add to his thinking or not? Thank you.
I think there's enough for you guys to chew on there. Yeah.
Go first, you want to?
Sure. Well, first of all, of course, it's a very typical process of negotiation. It's a compromise, but what's make it stand out that it's really, you can see two parallel processes, really. Development of the Cold War, and you can really relate how the argument changed with particular kind of events on the ground, really. You can see hardening of the positions. Americans first, I would argue, I mean, they came kind of in good faith negotiation. They really hoped to draft sort of, good, viable document, but then you can see it how they react and how the Soviets, conduct themselves. For the Soviets, from day one, it was realpolitik. There is no humanitarian or legalistic concern. They just realpolitik, protect ourselves, and then how to use it as a weapon. I mean, it's very clear. So you can see this hardening of the position. So in that sense, I would argue that it's quite unique document. I mean, of course, you can see similar kind of line in negotiation of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, except here we know the difference, convention versus declaration, right? This is based much more on the Genocide Convention. West Germany, very interesting case. It comes a bit later because Germany is still, administered by their power. It comes to the up in the conversation, particularly in 1953-54, when West Germany is about to adopt the law on the genocide, basically. Lampkin, of course, thrust himself in this discussion. Again, not very wholly diplomatically, claiming that the Bonn is, full of communists. And I mean, so he wanted to change the wording of the German law on genocide, well, draft law on genocide, so that it would include basically the treatment of, expelled, Vertriebene, expelled ethnic Germans. So that will be covered by the Genocide Convention.
Yeah.
And then here, for example, emigre Estonians and Lithuanians coming in, or from their perspective of ethnic deportation, they support that. I mean, Estonians, Latvians,
He was
Lithuanians.
also, on this point, I remember seeing documentation in his papers where he has a correspondence with German veterans organizations, like ex-German Wehrmacht soldiers, who were, of course, trying to murder him just like a few years earlier. And about the translation of the word genocide into German, Vernichtung oder Zerstörung. And he didn't want Vernichtung because extermination was too narrow on physical genocide and excluded trying to smuggle the culture back in. Is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah. So he oscillates in his views of genocide depending on circumstances. Okay.
Finally, about Poland, I mean, of course, I'm not an expert in that, but looking from a contemporary perspective, since 10 years ago, when in Poland we see this kind of move to kind of appropriate Lampkin, right? That's to say that, well, all his ideas coming from the Polish legal tradition, and he is actually Rafał Lampkin, right, as in your book, actually, politically correct way to say it in Poland. So, but I'll let probably Doug to say more about that.
Do you want me to go on about the Polish thing? I think, there's the question of the West German, how they understood genocide. I'm going to have to pass on that. And that's simply because I couldn't find very much correspondences between West German sources and Lampkin. And of course, there's the whole history of, the UN, right? Which I was primarily looking at those papers. So I do a polite pass. But it'd be a wonderful book, which I think should be written. Is the drafting process normal in the context of UN? The only thing that's new about it is Lampkin's alliance with the NGOs at the UN and then the corresponding civil society institutions. Lampkin, it's really fascinating to watch this guy. There's a Lampkin for everybody. That's just, you have a way of looking at the world, there's a Lampkin for you, right? That's because he told everybody everything that they wanted to hear. So you find this really interesting constellation. I got this tipped off in Lampkin's memoirs where he said, we wouldn't have a genocide convention if it weren't for the women's groups at the United Nations. And lo and behold, there's Lampkin telling the women's groups that this is a way to actually prevent and include into war crimes, sexual violence, right? And so you go back and you read Access Rule, and you're like, sure enough, here's Lampkin. He's got all these laws about Nazi forced impregnations, right? The financing of babies born out of wedlock of a German blood. Well, of course, he presents himself as being like in the vanguard, right? I predicted this, right? My guess is Lampkin just had these laws that were there because he found them, right? But he spins this at the UN to say, I've been at the forefront of trying to include into war crimes rape. And he has these women come and tell stories of being violated by, there's records of this in the UN, in the building across the street, the World Council of Churches building. There's a whole collection of Czechoslovakian women who organized through their churches. This had an impact on the governments that were democratically elected governments, right? You can embarrass leaders in front of their own populations. That's crucial. I think that, other than that, it's actually just more of the same. Right, that's my answer to that. The Lampkin's thinking, it was that the town he was born in was absolutely vital to his thinking. I mean, this was crucial, and in fact, his father probably made sure he learned Hebrew as a living language, right? And his mother was actually quite moving away from it, right? Teaching him the literature of Russian poetry and so forth. So there's tensions in Lampkin's experience. You could write a whole book on it. Right? I have. But more importantly, David Crow has he's got a book that's coming out where he's actually found Lampkin's records in gymnasium, right? His schooling records, right? His the local Hebrew schools that he went to is crucial, absolutely crucial.
But in what ways? I think the question was how
in what
did it
ways?
form
Yeah,
his thinking, this intense religious
Lampkin.
upbringing?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about Lampkin is he never says a single word about having a Jewish life, right? He doesn't write about it. He doesn't write about his Jewish experiences. The only things he has to say about the Jewish tradition writ large is that there's genocide all throughout the Bible, right? He catalogs over and over and over. And there's this interesting moment so I think his relationship with that Jewish identity is contentious in himself, but at the same time, he's so thoroughly culturally Jewish in his way of thinking. So what you get in Lampkin is you get a tension with his Jewish identity that surfaces. You get this notion that you catch him in his autobiography should not be read as facts. It should be read as who does Lampkin think he is, which is very telling. And that's actually the value of it, not as having anything historically accurate. There's a tension there in the sense that my Hebrew teachers would not provide a legitimate denunciation of violence. They found violence that they thought was good, right? That they advocated for.
So did he until
But
the
so
late
did he.
20s.
That's right. So did he.
He believed in ethics of revenge.
In his early teenage years and his early
Until his
college years.
Late 20s.
Yeah. No, that's right.
The Armenian, no, was it the,
Yep.
yeah,
No, that's right.
yeah.
Right.
But what about,
The Polish prosecutor. I think.
come back? Yeah.
I think.
Could I just, sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
try to get a proper discussion here. Did you guys who've raised your hands want to come in on this Jewish point or make separate points? Separate points, okay. Does Rotem, do you want to say something about Jim's book? Jim Loeffler, who's a mutual colleague and friend, wrote this incredibly important article in the Journal of Genocide Research last year, which talks about his Zionist youth, which you may have seen. A colleague, have you seen that article? Okay, so do you want to? Okay.
Jim brought a lot of evidence of Lampkin's early Zionism.
Use the mic, mate.
Jim Loeffler, in this article that Dirk has mentioned, brings quite a lot of evidence, very compelling, of Lampkin's early Zionism. He makes some interpretive claims that I will take issue with in my own lecture, but this is it.
Okay.
That's
So
what we
I'll
have
direct
offer here.
your attention to I'll send you the article later if we exchange emails, where Jim Loeffler discovered articles in the Polish, Yiddish, and Hebrew language press in the 20s and 30s, where Lampkin is an out-and-out Jewish nationalist, and at the revisionist end of the spectrum of he believed in Jewish statehood in the 1920s.
I will add one thing to this is John Cooper had found the same letters, right? But the difference is the question of how important do you think those writings are in the 1920s upon the person who Lampkin would become. And that's that crucial question is, how much does that youth actually, really bear out in Lampkin's experience after he graduates for college? And that's a tension in the people who study Lampkin.
You want to say something on that point? Yeah.
Sure. And again, there are two things here. First, the evolution of kind of Lampkin's legal thought in the late Lampkin, when he was using expediency to such extent, and again, kind of illustrate, his Jewishness. Okay, 45 of his relatives were murdered in the Holocaust, and here he is, co-writing the text of exhibition with Lithuanian immigrants called Genocide, and it doesn't mention the Jews, 200,000 Jews who were murdered in Lithuania at all. So, here he's working, trying to advance the argument, which is good for Lithuanians or Ukrainians. Altogether, I would say it's very interesting from the point of view of sort of East European emigre politics. It's really, we can see this international criminal law is one of the sort of entries in almost their international politics and Cold War politics. A very interesting point, really.
So we'll get to that next round, but you wanted to say something about his role as a prosecutor, which was also Piotr's question. And then we'll move on to the next round.
The university in Lvov had a really, really vibrant Jewish faculty, in an interesting kind of a way. Not necessarily on the faculty, but there's a community there. Emil Rappaport was somebody who was, in his own personal life, incredibly, incredibly faithful to protecting Jewish students. Lampkin gets kicked out of this other university because he's in a pretty anti-Semitic episode, and David Crow has found the personnel records, or Lampkin is basically, he's kicked out for being Jewish along with a whole bunch of other Jewish individuals. And then the faculty in Lvov actually takes a number of these, and there's personnel records from Lvov where they're actually saying we're going to, you bring these Jewish students on. That career, Lampkin's career as a public prosecutor is created by his law professors who opened the doors for him into this career. And I think for Lampkin, it becomes everything. It's a paycheck, it's a livelihood, it's credibility, it's sort of, but it's also more importantly this other connection to his professors, which I think is a really important part of his experience there. Yeah. Yeah.
So in a way, he was a member of, give me this, oppressive power.
Colonial power from a
Yeah.
Ukrainian perspective.
No, that's right.
And the Ukrainians
Totally,
so, right?
totally, yeah.
What are we doing?
Yeah, I think the Polish Lampkin needs to be more researched in much greater depth, and we need people with the language capacities to do that. Claudia Kraft has written a bit on interwar Lampkin. She's a German expert on Polish law, legal scholarship in the interwar years, but she's moved on to other topics. But we're going to move on to another round of names. I've seen Alexander Kopp, Alain Confino, Michel Toussaint, and someone else had their name, Andrea. Andrea was there. I'm going to make sure everyone gets a chance now because we're running short of time. And yes, your name is Scheinde. Okay, Alex.
Thank you. Alex Korb from Leicester. I have a bit of a provocative observation, which was triggered by Doug, who said there is a bit of Lampkin for everybody. So I was wondering why we are actually omitting how the Nazis used the term genocide, or Völkermord, of course. And the fact that they were committing genocides wouldn't prevent them from using a language of humanitarianism when they needed to. So any examples? I think this is a little bit of a void because it doesn't really fit to approach that question. I think it's about the time to revisit the Nazis and their use of the concept. And also, of course, during the war, they started reaching out for anti-imperialist nationalists in the colonies and, in a way, developing a sense of anti-imperialist rhetoric. And so I'm also wondering how, when did those nationalists from the colonies, maybe empowered by the Nazis a little bit, see the concept as something they would be able to use against the colonial powers. We've mentioned, and I'm grateful for that, the governments of Egypt, Pakistan, India, and so on. But like from a grassroots level, would you have any examples where nationalists in the colonies start using that rhetoric? Thank you.
That's a very mischievous question, Alec. Alon.
Thank you for great papers and commentary. I have two thoughts to share. So I want to go back to Dirk's argument, in which he said, if I understand correctly, that we should go beyond a Lampkin-centric analysis of the idea of the concept of genocide in the 40s. And he says, you know, there were many other terms that we can use, that could have been used. And there are other trends in European politics, society, and beyond. So what do we do with this? I'd like first to ask Dirk, maybe he can elaborate a little bit more briefly about it. So what does the argument contain beyond a Lampkin-centric history and historiography? What do you mean? And maybe to ask the panelists to address it and how does it fit within your argument? Because it seems to me quite a radical idea with respect to the current historiography. The other thought that I have is whether the glass is half full or half empty. Let me explain. There is a tone that I read, perhaps I'm wrong, but a tone in which said, you know, there was this very important concept, but it got bogged down. You know, the superpowers, other states, the UN, it fizzled away, Lampkin and his personality. It took 50 years until something happened with it. Not a great history, the glass half empty. On the other hand, we can say, well, people in the 1940s invented this term. Whatever legal scholars think it's this and that, the term, as a metaphoric term, has power, has meaning. If you ask people in the street, they may not know if it's this or that, if it's a crime, but they know it's something bad, it's something that you do to other people. This is important. Yes, it took 50 years, but perhaps historians in 20 years just say, well, there was the first chapter, the first 50 years, and then it took life of its own, and it was very important. And when we think that the countries of the world cannot agree now how to stop gas emissions for our cars, which is relatively easy, so they had some disagreements about genocide. Well, I can see that, since many countries, if not all, well, all I don't know, but which country does not come close to genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes, etc. So maybe the glass is half full nonetheless.
Joe.
I agree. I really appreciated the political origins of the concept, and that knowing that story is so important. We've done it with the concept of human rights. We've done it with the institution of the UN, the suspect colonial origins, the suspect personal gain origins of Lampkin's sort of own desire to sort of push things through. But I really am suspect of the debunking project as an intellectual project. I am in that glass half full side of things because I do think it matters that we don't just understand these concepts as bound by their own histories and forever bound by that origin moment, that what it was, yes, it might not have been a very noble birth, but it was the birth of something that is used not just by lawyers. I'm so tired of lawyers. It's not just stuff that happens in in the back rooms of negotiations, but I think what is interesting is how the concept becomes used and gets life, right? And I mean that intentionally, that different groups and different organizations have a way to use the concept of genocide for maybe their own political ends, but it does become a concept that allows a conversation about mass murder in a way that simply calling it mass murder like everything else, flattening it out and saying, you know, this death is just as significant as this death, it allows us to say what are limits and what are things, can things possibly be done outside of the realm of legalizing the legal realm. And so I guess I would just, I really think the that political origin stuff is really important, but I think we can't just use debunking as a way of understanding the uses and misuses of a concept, because then the options, I think, are quite problematic, meaning we throw out the concept completely, or we don't really take it seriously as it was used historically by groups that were affected, and also groups that in the future might have a use for the concept. So I'm very suspect of that project.
Andrea, prego. For the mic.
No, it's good because some of the things that Alexander and Alon and also anticipate what I wanted to say and to ask also. As to the concept, I find that there is a parallelism with totalitarianism in this way. These are fake concepts, if you look at them very closely, and actually misleading ones, and I'm losing everything. And but they are, they've been, their success has been huge. Their political influence has been huge. People have been using them. You cannot deny or abandon them. They are too strong. So the problem is not that debunking means abandoning them, because they cannot be abandoned, but it means to understand them. And this way, and then I come to the question through this. I agree that the concept led to ethnicization. This is one of the main problems I have with the concept, how it developed. But in a way, it was inevitable because genocidio is genos. It's a Greek word for genos, which is death. It is, the nation is not anything else. And this leads me to the question and to the importance of the environment in which it was developed, which was Lvov or Lviv or whatever, Leopold, as you want to call it. And the question, I have one specific question in general. Lvov has been one of the most important cities in Europe as far as capacity for analyzing the 20th century has been. If you think of Namur, which means Toynbee, as a Toynbee basically applied Namur concept. If you think of Namur and all this concept of, from Vienna to Versailles and these ideas of the role of the European Middle East, as he called the countries between Berlin and Moscow, great concept. If you think of Ludwig von Mises and this criticism of socialism and that came from Lviv, if you think of all the Bundists and the ideology. So the first question is this Ehrlich, that was his professor, a relative to the Ehrlich people, to Hendrik? Because Hendrik Ehrlich studied at Lviv at the law faculty, and of course he married Simon Dubnov's daughter. And was this the same environment of the Bundists also, besides being very close to the nationalist Zionists? Or not? This is a question, just asking if there were relatives or not. And the other, of course, and this Alexander is very right, we have genocide as a new concept, but of course, if you read the literature, the German literature in the 19th century, you have Völkermord all the time. Otto Bauer speaks of Völkermord all the time in his book of the nationality. So it's the same culture. What is the relation between this and genocide? Because he was reading about Völkermord in Otto Bauer on socialism and nationalism all the time. So my question is about this cultural environment, which is so important. And of course, if this is true, and I am going back, the problem is that this concept of people, of folk, we know is totally tricky. It's more trickier even than genocide. So it's the premise that is wrong, theoretically, and leads to ethnicization and to the problems. And the final question, so, because Lampkin seemed to be conscious of this, because then he speaks of people, then he speaks of groups. So when he starts to get free of people and embracing groups?
Final question to Shindi.
Hi, my question is one more of curiosity about the convention. I was wondering because when the convention is formulated, the intention was to hold Germany accountable and in a way to make an example of Germany after its defeat. And on the other hand, there was this discomfort with the term colonial. So I was just wondering, in the drafts of the Genocide Convention, did the case of the Herero tribes in Namibia ever come up? Like, does it come up in the discussion at any point?
Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, we have about 10 minutes, right? Okay, and then we have lunch. Okay.
Okay, I can go first. If we were in a classroom, of course, we can kind of ask participants who thinks it's a half glass, half empty glass or half full. I'm afraid I'm on the side of a pessimist. I consider it a half empty glass. And what I see here, if you look at the whole history of the Cold War, the 40 years, the concept really has been bankrupted, basically, from my perspective. It's also a bit dangerous to consider it's kind of a case of a moral concept, moral nadir, because it is a legal concept. It should really work. At the same time, I should be clear that there is no attempt sort of debunking the concept or engage in sort of iconoclasm against Lampkin. It's kind of more introduce sort of, different perspectives, sort of complexity in the issue. You don't see Lampkin there as a sort of a prophet, very well one-dimensional sort of a portrayal, which we have had for the past, X number of years. Also, when it comes to colonial question, we should understand that when you put question of Genocide Convention along the other issues that the post-World War has to face, it's very minor. It's like this. There's a Berlin crisis, Palestine, control of atomic weapons. We kind of sort of read too much in the importance of this issue altogether. It wasn't. And when it comes, for example, nationalist on the ground, also we should remember that it was a pre-internet age. Everything was on paper. When you get these documents published by the UN, only a few libraries probably had it. Only a few people knew about it, except national delegations who engaged in that. So in that sense, there is nothing what I've seen kind of on the grassroots level. It's really goal on political level. It's the foreign ministries of each country that really discussing it. When it comes to Herero and historical cases, basically the whole idea of international conception, so it's not conventional, so it's not connected to any particular cases of mass violence. The only one during the discussion, two cases, only like as a kind of one as a footnote when it was Armenian genocide. It was mentioned actually even pre-Armenian genocide, like someone mentioned that the Turks, abducting Armenians, turning them into Yanычars. And then the Turks immediately kind of objected, so let's say 46 or 47. Another case that specifically kind of made inroads and actually influenced the Genocide Convention, the wording of the Genocide Convention, actually civil war in Greece. This reference of transfer of children from one group to another, it relates specifically to the Greek case. And again, Soviets kind of objected, but not sincerely enough, because, not particular case mentioned, but it was understood that that's what it is, also in a kind of controversial case. And also.
I think those last comments were really more of a conversation. With this question of the colonial nationalist leaders in the colonies using genocide, that's a tricky question. You could probably have I don't know personally about the nationalist leaders within particular countries, but there is the inroads there would be, who are their representatives at the UN in the 40s, right? These are Western educated kind of folks. So that would be the first place to start to figure out this puzzle, is how the word moved, the networks. I think I used to be a glass half full person, thinking about it's really important to have activism and mobilization around the concept of genocide. But for the last 4 years, our program at George Mason, we had a contract for the Swiss government to evaluate the National Dialogue Commission in Burundi. And it's pretty incredible to be watching the way people use the word genocide to try to get the U.S. to intervene on their behalf, how it's leveraged, who says it and when it appears in French, who's the audience. And you start to piece this together, and then all of a sudden you realize that mobilizations around lobbying effects, they actually prevent a lot of the nuanced peace work that's necessary to make peace in the context of violence. So I'm no longer on the glass is half empty. I'm kind of on the, this is, the politicization of this word is really problematic. I mean, if you care about human life, and you see the way this word can really, really be politicized and used in self-righteous ways, it's, for me, I have to step back and look at this as a historical phenomenon. And let's just study this as a historical phenomenon. In certain cases, yeah, it's wonderful, right? In other cases, it's problematic. You know, and this whole, and then cycling back and, you know, I think going beyond the word, for me, I would prefer, I mean, I'm titling my next book, which is halfway done, Dying in the Age of Thoughtlessness, right? I mean, the way these concepts like genocide and terrorism prevent us from actually understanding, you know, the relationship of violence within human societies. And there's elements of this in a lot of books that are written by my colleagues here. And I think that's, for me, it's actually beneficial in a lot of ways to bracket the concept of genocide over there and then start talking about a lot of the other things that actually happen in human societies, right? Discrimination and denial of basic rights and the way that groups interact with each other to construct, you know, all of these things that genocide studies scholars study, but maybe hold off on the genocide concept as the analytical tool. And then, you know, back to Lvov, you know, that's a great question about this Ehrlich and his relationship. That's a really beautiful question, because I think the cultural milieu was there for Lampkin to be enriched by. I mean, that's just so clear. And Lampkin is this person of contradictions, right? I mean, he doesn't seem to really worry about two groups that have contradictory ideas. He kind of takes them both and sees no contradiction. And so he's a great absorber and then sort of refashioning things to shape his ideas. So I can imagine a world, and well, it actually happened. I mean, we have papers of Lampkin as a really, as a youth, as a Zionist sort of, and at the same time contemplating ideas that are quite contrary to it. I think that milieu is actually part of the story of the origins of this idea. But then the Dubnov part is really, really interesting, because there's whole passages of Lampkin's papers later in life where he's basically plagiarizing Dubnov. I mean, his whole analysis of colonial violence and the relationship of identity, economics, and then the use of racism to mobilize forces against colonial victims, this comes from Dubnov. It's like 3 pages. It's just word for word. And then that's the question of Volkmordor, right? And Lampkin sort of, it gets into this. Nationocides was used in Italian to refer to the Vendee massacre. You have Volkmordor. Lampkin argues that Volkmordor has too much of the Herderian and Fichte sense of the Volk. And he says that Herder and Fichte gave birth to this idea which became the Nazi genocide, right? So he's trying to move past this idea of a Volk, right? And I don't think he does it. His friend Hans Kohn, the guy who created the Small is Beautiful movement in international relations, he writes this letter to Lampkin saying, look, you're going down the same path of the very people you're arguing against. You're going to end up with a genocide convention that memorializes particular groups and validates them as unchanging. And Lampkin writes back, no, I'm trying to get rid of it. And he said, the point is, like, it's a beautiful letter. And so anyway, that's more the complexity. Yeah, I have it cited in the, yeah. And you have Hans Kohn's letter to Lampkin, which I saved. And anyway, I'm probably babbling on now.
Well, one more thing, if we're talking about, you know, pessimist versus optimist, if you superimpose it to the classical sort of division with international law between realists and idealists, that's what the British argue, for example, said, well, you guys think we're bad people, we're pessimists. No, we're just realists. And here is one longer quotation, which I didn't have time to quote, but I have now. Sir Hartley Shawcross speaking in the 6th Legal Committee on October 1st, 1948. That's what he says. Recalling the Nuremberg trials, the representative of the United Kingdom pointed out that nobody believed that the existence of a convention such as it was proposed would have deterred the Nazis or fascists from committing the atrocious crimes of which they had been guilty. Those crimes were allegedly the crimes of totalitarian states, which would not change their methods because of the existence of a convention to which a number of nations had adhered. So basically, we can also, you know, approach it from this direction.
I think I might try my hand at answering Alexander's first question about the Nazis' use of the term Völkermord, obviously they didn't use the term genocide, for propagandistic purposes. And then you suggested a transfer of that notion, if I'm not mistaken, to anti-colonial leaders during the war and then perhaps after. Leaving aside the mischievous implication that anti-colonial movements may be seen as somehow tainted by Nazi worldviews, which you might be driving at, and I would take issue with. It's a completely legitimate point to make, and I think can be, I don't know the Nazi sources on that like you do, but I've read a lot of pan-German propaganda and literature from the 1890s until the 1930s. And one could, if one, again, was being mischievous, postulate that they invented the notion of the field of comparative genocide studies avant la lettre, because they were so obsessed with British colonial crimes as a license for their own, and cover for their own violent fantasies of colonization, particularly in Africa, that they were adept at listing and cataloging all the misdeeds by the British Empire, massacres, around the place, slavery, exploitation, and of course the Spanish before them and the Portuguese. And so they catalog in historically very accurate ways, because they set their best people off in the Foreign Office and so forth, Colonial Office, to catalog these crimes by other empires in a way that is disarmingly familiar to those of us who are interested in colonial crimes, as I was about 10 years ago. And now I would say to that, in the next stage, that doesn't make me a Nazi. Just because the Nazis engaged in this, and Pan-Germans engaged in the cataloging of other empires' crimes, doesn't mean it's illegitimate to do that now. And I'm sure you're not suggesting it is either. The question is, I guess we're all engaged in the process, in the project of investigating the reasons for these crimes by all states, and not as an excuse for the state to which you're loyal can somehow be exculpated as just like the others. Who knows? I do have the feeling sometimes that there are people, especially those that work in academies of science, and they're therefore part of a state apparatus, scholars, are engaged in what the Germans call Feindforschung, which is research on the enemy, so they can dig up as much dirt as they can and exculpate their own state because they're the victims somehow, maybe 100 years ago. I do see quite a lot of that, and sometimes they submit articles to the journal that I edit, and we see through that quite a way. But I don't think that could be attributed to any people in this room. So if I'm not mistaken, organizers of this conference, we should repair to the other room for a sandwich. Is that right? Do you want to say something?
Yeah, the announcement. Okay.
Yeah.
So the first announcement is, although Toronto is now one of the most multicultural cities in the world, you are in the heart of English-Scottish building of Canada that's worth seeing. So if you're not from Toronto, I advise a few things you can do if you're going to have a little time to walk around. If you come out of this building and go to the left, the building across the street from you that you see the back of is University College, which was the largest building of mid-19th century English Canada. Of course, French Canada did other things. And to its right-hand side is Knox College, one of the Presbyterian Scots' great buildings that are worth seeing. If you come out to this main street and make a right, you will see the horrible, brutal style, this is prejudice in architecture, library. It will fool you. On the left-hand side is the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. Go inside it. It is, for a bibliophile, is one of the most beautiful views to see. If you go to the left coming out of this main street, on your left-hand side will be Trinity College, which is the high Anglican college. On the other side of the street is Wycliffe, which is the low Anglican college. And if you go out to the main park, which is Queen's Park,
you will find not a statue of Victoria, though Canada is the only country of the Commonwealth that celebrates Victoria Day. You will find a statue of Edward VII. And the reason some should see it is it was a statue that was given by Calcutta to Toronto when Calcutta didn't really want to have any colonial ways. And of course, parsimonious Toronto took the statue. So it's definitely worth, so if you get a little chance, walk around to those. And with that, Martha will make some important.
Only to say we seek to be hospitable, and I just ask that those who don't have a lanyard allow those with these lanyards. Those are our guests who've come as participants and early career scholars to partake in lunch, so that we make sure that they do indeed get a lunch, because it's the only lunch they'll have. So if you're a local Toronto scholar, hang back a little, and I think there's enough for everyone, but I want to be sure our guests.
This is miracle to create something.
I think there's plenty, but our scholars, this is their lunch today for invited guests. Thank you.